Hi everyone, there's a challenge going on Facebook at the moment to name the 10 albums that have most shaped you as a person. Not necessarily your 10 favourite albums, but those that have most had the effect on you during your life. So this morning I got challenged by my friend Dan to take part, and I thought, well, I'll do mine as a video. So I'm going to grab a brew, it's a lovely day, I'm going to go out into the garden and I'm going to talk you through my 10. So I'd love to see in the comments your 10 albums that shaped your life, or if you've got any comments on any of the albums that I'm going to talk about, then again let me know in the comments. Okay, so I'm going to go through these in the order of when I got to know them, and the first one from 1982. Adam and the Ants, Prince Charming. I absolutely love this album, and the one that came before it, Kings of the Wild Frontier. These really got me into music, and I remember my mum wanted me to learn to type when I was about 10 years old, and the way that she got me to type was to type out the lyrics to the Adam and the Ants albums, and things like that just stay with you forever, really. I remember being on holiday in 1982 in Tenerife when they split up, and it was in the newspapers. Holiday absolutely ruined. But this album's full of absolute classic songs, and Adam and the Ants were my first big band. Next up, from about a year later, Eurythmics, Touch. So this was the first album I ever bought with my own money. It was one of those, you get your Woolworths vouchers for Christmas, and then as soon as it opens up a few days later, you're straight down there, and this was what I got for Christmas 1983. And it's an album that I've never really stopped listening to. It's a synth classic, and it still stands up to this day. Absolute genius. I then sort of started listening to records that were in the house. And the one that always drew me, and which has probably had more effect on me than anything else ever, is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. For me, it's the greatest album that's ever been made by anybody. What they did with the technology that they had available was just absolutely unbelievable. And obviously I wasn't there at the time when this came out in 1967, but hearing about sort of how it just changed. It changed the world, did this album. It didn't just change music, it changed the world in many ways. And it's just an absolutely incredible piece of work. And then, 1986, a band from Hull came along and just absolutely grabbed me and have never let go in the 34 years since. The House Martins. London 0 Hull 4, their first album, and it's, as it says, does it say on it? Yes, it says on there, 16 songs, 17 hits. It's amazing from start to finish. I absolutely adore this album. It doesn't push any boundaries, not musically anyway, but lyrically it says an awful lot. Just things like Happy Hour, that's an absolute classic to people of my era. It's pretty impossible to be my age and not have Happy Hour as one of your classic songs. But that will forever be one of my favourite albums of all time. Now, it would have been very easy for me to have just had 10 Beatles or Paul McCartney albums, but I've tried not to do that. I've tried to be varied. But there's one album that I couldn't leave out. Because it just had such an effect on me, and that was this hits album, All the Best, from Paul McCartney, that came out in 1987. So this was my introduction to him as a solo artist, and everything that he'd done in the sort of 17 years up to that point since the Beatles finished. And I must have played this album so many hundreds of times, and it's no surprise, it's no secret that I'm a McCartney fanboy. I have been ever since, and it's all thanks to this album. That and Sgt. Pepper have been just the two biggest things for me, without an absolute doubt. So, moving forward, I got a bit old before my time, really. So back in the early 90s, so I'd left school at 16. I didn't do A-levels, I didn't go to university, so I sort of left most of my school friends behind when I was 16, and I always felt like I was missing out on still being with them, and I became a bit of an old man musically. So in the early 90s, while all my friends were probably doing raves and listening to sort of dance music and everything. I was listening to Elton John and Simon and Garfunkel and Queen and McCartney and things like that. And then I came late to this particular party, and I think this brought me back down to earth and brought me back to being the age that I actually was. And it's the Stone Roses, their debut album. So what happened for me was, I completely missed the boat with this for the first sort of 2 or 3 years of them being around after this album came out. I don't know why, but that's just how it happened. And on my 21st birthday, while most people for the 21st birthday will go on some sort of exciting excursion or have a massive party, I went to Granada Studios to visit the Coronation Street set with my mum and dad. That's how rock and roll I am. And on that day, we got back home from the Granada Studios tour, and just by chance there was a programme on the telly all about sort of music that had been made at Granada Studios. So it was very much sort of featuring Tony Wilson and all sorts of things that had happened around that era, and it showed Stone Roses doing Waterfall. You might have seen the clip. It's sort of them just with a very sort of plain white background, and it just absolutely captured me. And like I say, it brought me back to being the age that I was, rather than the sort of old man that I'd become musically at the time. And Waterfall's obviously a classic. I Want to Be Adored, it's a brilliant opening. I still say that those last 2 songs, this is the one, I Am the Resurrection, that to me is just about the best 2-song album closer that I've ever heard in my life. Maybe the Beatles' Revolver might beat it, but just an incredible album that's one of the best debut albums of all time, I would say. And that really then sort of opened some doors for me to get into things that I probably should have been into at my age. And you can certainly see that on some of the ones that are coming up. But also around that time, an album came out by a band that I had a bit of a weird history with. I detested this band during the 1980s. But then a particular song came out, and I just thought, you can't ignore that. That's a classic. That song was With or Without You, U2 from the Joshua Tree. So I started to get into them, and I enjoyed Rattle and Hum. But then this came out in 1991, Achtung Baby. And my main memory of this was I got chicken pox just as this came out. So I bought this album, got chicken pox, and had 3 weeks off work. And I just pretty much listened to this album for 3 weeks. And it was just so incredible compared to everything that they'd done before, the way that they'd started. They'd got groovy, they'd got funky and dancey, compared to the sort of all this sort of Americana stuff that they'd been doing for the few years before. And you put Zoo Station on the opening track, and it sounds like your hi-fi system's broken. But it just sounds crazy. But absolutely fell in love with this album, and then sort of caught up with everything that U2 had done before, and I've stuck with them since. It's not all been great. It's been an interesting journey along the way, but that is a very, very important album for me. Now, I and ahed about this next one. Not because of how important it is, but I thought it's cheating if you put like a greatest hits or a compilation album in, because I really wanted to put Queen's greatest hits in, but that hasn't made the cut. But I couldn't ignore this one, and this would have been the early 90s when I got into this, and it's The Cure. It's the Staring at the Sea singles collection. So I pretty much knew nothing about The Cure until about 1992. It was another thing that completely passed me by. And then I started to hear various things which it turned out were from this album, and I bought this, and I just think as a compilation, Queen's Greatest Hits obviously is a legendary album in its own right, but as a compilation this is up there. The first 7 songs, can you see that? You probably get a close up on that. I think that's one of the greatest openings to any album, compilation or otherwise, that I've ever heard. It's just absolutely fantastic, and that got me into The Cure. I've got most of their albums now, been listening to them loads ever since, but it was absolutely that album that got me sort of turning to that kind of style of music. So I mentioned about Stone Roses and how that kind of sort of brought me back down to earth a bit, and got me sort of the age that I should be. And that was really valid. So 1992 is when I got into Stone Roses. The year afterwards, then it started to be Britpop hit, and I was a massive Britpop fan, and this album was the start of that. I believe anyway. Different people have their own interpretation, but for me the release of that said something's happening here. It's the debut album by Suede. Still, for me, it's the best album. I know a lot of people prefer Dogman Star or some of their other stuff, but for me, it's this opening album. So I absolutely hammered this in 1993 when this first came out. This is the CD that I bought at the time, and it really sort of got me into that frame of mind for what was going to come with later on with the rest of Britpop. Even though that's sort of slightly, it's not full on Britpop, but it's absolutely kick-started that movement, I think. So that's 9 of my 10. Got one left, and it's still the Britpop era. So actually, of all these albums that have shaped me, this one has its 25th anniversary this year, and this is the newest one. I wasn't quite sure which album to go with, but I eventually went with, from this particular band, I went with What's the Story, Morning Glory by Oasis. I could have gone with Definitely Maybe, but I think that was sort of the introduction. That was just sort of getting into that swing of things. This is the one where it just exploded, and any of you who were around at the time, who were in the UK at the time, will just know how massive this was. You had album tracks being played on the radio all the time, which is pretty unheard of. You had B-sides being played on the radio all the time, which is pretty unheard of. This was absolutely everywhere, and it sort of changed the way that the UK was at the time. Absolutely massive. Had a massive effect on me. I've always been a big Oasis fan, and I've carried on with the solo careers afterwards. But this was just one of the biggest things that really I've experienced musically during my lifetime. So there you go. That's my 10. Didn't want to do a Facebook status. Just thought I'd rather do it this way. They're the 10 albums that have shaped me. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you again sometime. Cheers. Bye bye.